Welcome to Felon, True Crime Podcast, Episode 4, Eugenia Falleni, the woman with a secret. Episode 3 was a tragic story of love, deception, and murder. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I would suggest starting there before continuing. Listeners are advised that this episode contains descriptions of adult themes, sexual references, violence, and rape. Nothing in this world is hidden forever. The gold which has lain for centuries unsuspected in the ground reveals itself one day on the surface. Sand turns traitor and betrays the footstep that has passed over it. Water gives back to the telltale surface the body that has been drowned. Fire itself leaves the confession in ashes of the substance consumed in it. Hate breaks its prison secrecy in the thoughts through the doorway of the eyes, and love finds the Judas who betrays it by a kiss. Look where we will, the inevitable law of revelation is one of the laws of nature. The lasting preservation of a secret is a miracle which the world has never yet seen. Wilkie Collins. A lone woman stands on an unfamiliar dock. As she looks out on the sea, her thoughts carry her to another time. A time when she was happy. She reminisces about the salty ocean spray lapping at her face as she closed her eyes and embraced her newfound freedom. A life at sea offered not only an escape from the confines of land, but an escape from the confines of family, society, expectation, and questions. She had reflected on the stern words of her father and his shame, the shame in her mother's eyes. No one had understood her in her life on land. On the ship, no one would have to know her past. But this freedom would be short-lived, for the ship soon became her prison. As quickly as her mind had carried her away, it dropped her back on the dock in the bleak reality she now faced. Suddenly she felt cold. Her body bore marks of violence and abuse, but her soul ached more than her body ever could. Her hand, as if moved by instinct, stroked her stomach. An unborn being stirred inside her, a being whose very existence would not only haunt her as a reminder of her own identity, but would also come to reveal it in years to come. With a heavy heart, she shuffled away from the dock into a strange new land. If you cast your mind back to episode 3, we learned that Annie Burkett had discovered a secret about her husband, Harry Crawford, that changed their relationship dramatically and would soon seal her fate. But long before Annie's lifeless body would be consumed by fire in a national park, Harry had lived another life, a life as Eugenia Falleni. A series of events would occur in Eugenia's life that would bring Annie and Eugenia together in a tragic mess. On the 25th of July, 1875, Eugenia Falleni was born to Italian parents in Florence. When she was 2 years old, her family relocated to Wellington in New Zealand. Her father was known to be a stern man and quick to lay down the law and enforce it with his 17 children, Eugenia being the eldest. From an early age, Eugenia struggled with her identity. As she grew into her teens, she kept her hair short. Eugenia was reported to have been quite beautiful and received a considerable amount of romantic propositions from the gentlemen in her area. But she was also reported as being a typical tomboy and soon began dressing in male clothing. In her late teens, posing as a male, Eugenia started to work in brickyards and stables. She had a natural knack with horses, just like her father, who was employed as a carrier with a horse and cart. It is documented that her parents did not approve of or understand Eugenia's choice of attire and employment, and they were not shy in making this known to her. In September of 1894 in Wellington, New Zealand, a 19-year-old Eugenia was forced by her father into a marriage to a Bracelli Innocente. Her father hoping marriage would make her a normal woman. Eugenia soon discovered that Bracelli was already married and had a family in the New Zealand capital of Auckland. This provided Eugenia the perfect loophole to end the marriage, escaping back to Wellington and cutting ties with her father, for whom she now harboured bitter resentment. In the year 1895, at the age of 20, Eugenia boarded a freight ship to work as a seaman, using the name Eugene, the male form of Eugenia, as her alias. This would be a decision that would shape her life significantly, and in no way for the better. At first, Eugenia embraced the freedom of life at sea. She could be true to herself, and no one could question her. She was known to be dismissive when asked about her life in New Zealand, but this was a trait that was quite common with workers upon ships at the time. It seemed that many a seaman were either fleeing or hiding something. Working on a ship was the perfect way to discard an unwanted past. Dressing and posing as a male, Eugenia was considered a reliable and hard worker. She was small in stature, but she made up for it in strength and determination, and she quickly gained the trust of her fellow crew members, joining them in drinking, swearing, and the general stereotypical banter that the all-male crew would engage in. She seemed more than suited for life among men at sea, but this would be a short-lived reprieve for Eugenia. After around 18 months at sea, Eugenia started to engage in conversations with a Captain Martello. Martello was Italian-born, and this bond allowed the two to speak to each other in their native tongue. This would be an interaction that would soon lead to Eugenia's undoing. In one of their chats, Eugenia, reminiscing about her childhood, used a term that sounded odd to the captain. In describing an interaction with her grandmother, Eugenia stated that her grandmother had referred to her as Piccolina, meaning little one in Italian. What caught the captain's attention, though, was that Piccolina is a term reserved for referring to females, the male version being Piccolino. Despite Eugenia's best efforts to dismiss the slip-up as a simple mistake, the damage was done, and the suspicion of the captain would not subside. Being caught out as a female on a ship carried dangerous implications. Females aboard a sea vessel was considered bad luck. Not to mention that the seamen had been starved of female contact, and they were not known to be gentlemen. Eugenia knew she would not be treated well if discovered by her fellow crew members, and she went back to work, hoping that it would all blow over, but secretly knowing that it wouldn't. Captain Martello, fixed on settling his suspicions once and for all, invited Eugenia back to his cabin for another chat. While in his private chambers, he started to press her about his belief that she was in fact a woman, Eugenia all the while denying the claim. The captain, losing his patience, suddenly grabbed Eugenia and carried out a physical inspection of her body, thrusting his hand between her legs. When his suspicions were confirmed, Eugenia was raped. This would occur more than once. There are reports that suggest that other members of the crew were also involved in violent attacks on Eugenia, and she was kept prisoner aboard the ship. This would be Eugenia's lasting memory of life at sea. Her adventure that seemed to hold so much hope concluded when the ship arrived in Newcastle, Australia, where she was left at the dock like a discarded piece of cargo. As a result of the ongoing assaults, Eugenia had fallen pregnant. She was in a foreign country, she was alone, destitute, and soon to bear a child. In 1898, Eugenia gave birth to a daughter, naming her Josephine. It is documented that Eugenia did feel somewhat responsible for the welfare of Josephine, but she was also a reminder of a traumatic event that Eugenia would rather forget. Soon after her birth, Eugenia located a family friend, a Mrs. De Angelis, and left Josephine in her care. Eugenia soon adopted the identity of a male and started a new life as Harry Leo Crawford, working in a series of manual jobs in abattoirs, pubs, and factories. At times he would visit his daughter Josephine, but he would often show up drunk and become abusive towards Mrs. De Angelis. This would be a memory that Josephine carried with her into her teens. From a young age, Josephine was made aware of Harry's secret, and Harry entrusted Josephine to keep it. Only she and a small circle of people that knew his family were privy to that information. In the years to come, this would be information that he would regret sharing. Eugenia would live as Harry Crawford for a number of years, working, drinking, cursing and brawling with the men. It was a life that he came to embrace. During this time, Harry was reported to have been sexually intimate with quite a few ladies. An obvious hindrance to this scenario being the lack of a male appendage. This was something that Harry remedied with some creative thinking and craftsmanship. To secure his place in the world as a man, he carved a prosthetic penis from hardwood and carefully wrapped it with rubber and soft leather. It was a device he was very reluctant to use at first, fearing it would give away his identity. But on one night, in the company of a lady friend, he bound it to himself using bandages and put it to the test. To his surprise, it worked. He had to make sure that his partner's hands would not wander close to the foreign object, but soon, a number of women were convinced of his manhood. In the year 1912, his previous experience working with horses in New Zealand would allow him to cross paths with Annie Burkett when he started employment as a caretaker and sulky driver for Dr. G.R.C. Clark in the suburb of Warunga. As described in episode 3, the pair enjoyed a brief courtship and were married soon after. It was while living as Annie's husband that his past would come back to haunt him in the form of his daughter, Josephine. Not only was she a tie to his previous life, but she carried a secret that could bring his world crashing down. And we know now that it did. We continue now where episode 3 left off. Harry Crawford was being held in police custody following being implicated in the murder of his wife, Annie Burkett. The alleged motive being that Annie had discovered him to be a female, posing as a man she had fallen in love with and married. They had consummated the marriage, and they had continued to be intimate over the years that would follow. But this intimacy ended when Annie found out the truth about Harry. She felt repulsed, embarrassed, and violated. Harry's prosthetic device had served him well over the years while married to Annie. He kept it in a private case, hidden from where Annie could discover it. With the benefit of hindsight, there were some early clues. Annie had noticed that Harry was particularly shy about being seen naked, and he would always make sure that her hands never ventured to what he referred to as being out of bounds. Annie had even found a bloody sanitary pad in the bathroom, but Harry dismissed it as being used on an injury sustained at work. Annie had once walked in on him, binding his chest with bandages. Again, he dismissed it as an injury to his ribs, and insisted she forget about it. Yet despite these clues, Annie simply shrugged it off as little idiosyncrasies, until the secret that Josephine shared with a neighbour found its way to her, starting a tragic butterfly effect. The two continued to live in the same house with Annie's son for 8 months following the shocking revelation, not as husband and wife, simply coexisting out of convenience. The relationship grew cold, mainly from Annie's end. Annie wondering how to formally end the union, but Harry wanting to save the marriage and continue as normal. But this seemed far from normal to Annie. It was eventually decided by the pair that they would visit the Lane Cove National Park to have a final discussion of the matter. Annie would not return from this visit. An unidentified body would be found severely burnt in a makeshift fireplace. This body would remain unidentified until Annie's son and his aunt would do some digging into the past. Harry Leo Crawford would soon be the main suspect. Prior to being arrested, Harry had remarried. His wife, Elizabeth Allison, was blissfully unaware that Crawford was a woman. So much so that she thought she had fallen pregnant to him. This was later revealed to be her going through the change into menopause. Harry and Lizzie's home was searched, and police discovered his prosthetic appendage, which was taken as evidence. Harry Crawford elected to be placed in the women's cells. He returned to dressing as a woman, grew his hair out, and reverted to the name Eugenia Falleni. The case created a media circus. Reporters flocked to the story and used the strange circumstances to drum up stories for the latest edition of newspapers of the time. On the 8th of July in 1920, the Inspector General of Police pursued the exhumation of an unknown body they had now established to be Annie Burkett. The body underwent a second post-mortem. This second examination included x-rays and presented a new finding that it was very likely Annie could have sustained head injuries due to blunt force. Following this discovery, Annie was again buried, this time by her family, and this time with a name, at Warrenara Cemetery in the Sutherland Shire, south of Sydney. On the 1st of August in 1920, Eugenia stood trial for a committal hearing. The dentist who had made Annie's false teeth that were discovered in the fire stood as a witness. Annie's son Harry recounted a history of arguments and abuse directed at his mother by Felon. He also repeated the stories he had informed Detective Sergeant Stuart Robson of, in which Eugenia had taken him out on several occasions in strange outings. Eugenia had made him dig grave-sized holes in bushland. She had also tried to lure the boy to the edge of a cliff that is known as the notorious suicide spot. A potentially sinister detail in one of these trips was when they had travelled to a location by tram, Eugenia had only purchased one-way tickets. Harry also shared that following Annie's supposed departure, Eugenia had him scan the newspapers for any mentions of murders in the area, and showed specific interest in a particular newspaper article that presented a sketch of a pair of women's shoes, detailing the discovery of a woman's body found burned in Lane Cove National Park. Annie's sister, Lily Nugent, identified items belonging to Annie found at the scene of the fire. She also testified of receiving a cryptic letter about Annie discovering something strange about her husband Harry. Henrietta Scheiblich, the German lady who had rented Eugenia and Harry a room following the disappearance of Annie, informed the court that Eugenia, still in the guise of Harry, had said of Annie's disappearance that, "We had a jolly good row, and I gave her a crack on the head, and she cleared off." Josephine, Eugenia's daughter, had a statement that she had submitted to police prior to the hearing read out, a portion of it stating the following: "In 1917, I met with my mother, who told me everything was unsettled and upside down, as Mrs. Burkett had discovered she was a woman. My mother seemed very agitated, and was always reticent about herself." One of the more shocking revelations that was detailed during the proceedings was when the government medical officer, Dr. Palmer, offered the testimony that he believed the deceased died of burns and was alive when the fire began, due to the blistering on the skin, but he could not say if she was conscious or not. He finished with the statement that he believed small cracks to the skull were likely the result of the fire, but a more substantial one could have been evidence of violence. Following the presentation of the preceding evidence, Eugenia was committed for trial and refused bail. When Eugenia's trial commenced, the prosecutor painted a picture of her that she was so capable of deceit that she was able to fool not one but two women that she was biologically male, referencing what he referred to as an article being used to convince the women of her supposed manhood. The trial received widespread media attention, Eugenia all the while being paraded around like a circus freak. Despite there being a lack of direct evidence of Falleni causing the death of Annie, there was enough that made her innocence very questionable in the eyes of the jury. The prosecution used a number of witnesses that had come forward to claim they had seen the pair near to or during the weekend Annie disappeared. A neighbour of Harry and Annie claimed to see the pair walking along the street, one of them carrying a picnic basket. The neighbour also claimed that she never saw the deceased after that. A witness testified to seeing Harry Crawford load up Annie Burkett's possessions and furniture on a wagon on a day following the weekend she disappeared. When Harry was questioned by the neighbour, he claimed that Annie had run away with a plumber from Balmain. Another witness claimed to see a man close to the scene of the murder. She said she noticed him sitting on a rock with his head buried in his hands. He appeared to be very excited and nervous because when the witness came level with him, he jumped. The man was identified as bearing a resemblance to Harry Crawford. As damning as all these statements were, nothing was more damning than the list of excuses Harriet had shared with neighbours and friends when they inquired about Annie. A list of these excuses was read out. She was visiting friends at North Sydney. She had bolted with a plumber from Balmain. She had cleared out and left him without a penny. They had had many rows and he had to do something. They had a jolly good row and he gave her a crack over the head and she cleared out. Perhaps the last excuse on the list was the most accurate. Following a presentation of the evidence, the defence could offer very little rebuttal that would sway a jury. The strongest point that the defence put forward was that a witness had seen a disoriented woman near the scene of the fire around the time Annie disappeared, that potentially Annie had been there by herself and she may have fallen onto the fire by accident. Holding to this claim, Eugenia Falleni pleaded not guilty to the murder of Annie Burkett. It took the jury a mere 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty. Falleni was convicted and sentenced to death. Eugenia appealed this sentence, stating the evidence presented by the prosecution was weak and merely circumstantial. This appeal fell on deaf ears. The Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed her case standing by the original verdict of the jury. However, the death sentence initially handed down was repealed. Eugenia would escape with her life, but she would still serve time for the death of Annie Burkett. During her time in jail, Eugenia assumed the name Mrs. Jean Ford and served her time in Long Bay Jail until February 1931, when she was released, slipped back into obscurity and worked as a caretaker for a boarding house. On the 9th of June 1938, Mrs. Jean Ford, while running errands in the city, stepped off the pavement in front of a motor car and she was struck by it. She died of her injuries the following day in Sydney Hospital. The only person who truly knew what happened in Lane Cove on that tragic weekend was dead. True crime author Mark Tedeschi, in his book Eugenia Falleni, A True Story of Adversity, Tragedy, Crime and Courage, puts forward the following scenario of what was most likely to have occurred between Annie Burkett and Harry Crawford. While alone at the park, Annie had most likely shared with Harry that she wanted the marriage annulled. Harry, wanting to save the marriage, begged her to reconsider. A verbal altercation and struggle ensued. At some point, Annie was either struck or fell, striking her head. Harry, in a panic state, made a makeshift fire and attempted to cover up the evidence that he was involved, and also to attempt to cover up his true identity. But putting speculation aside, there are only two people that know what happened that day, and both of them are long gone. The story of Eugenia Falleni has been told a number of times, with a spectrum of tones in the narratives. As one listener noted, the story of Eugenia is commonly treated as either one of two ways: a misunderstood person in an intolerant society, or as a pervert. But with an honest reflection on Eugenia's life, we can come to the conclusion that her story is much more complex than that. For those wanting to learn more about Eugenia and this case, I would highly recommend the book Eugenia Falleni, A True Story of Adversity, Tragedy, Crime and Courage by Mark Tedeschi, QC.